Hi, Jocelyn, and thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk to us.
It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
Well, we're going to start, I thought, with a pretty big question for you as a historian of the feminist movement and thinking, how do you see the state currently? I mean, particularly given what's happened to abortion rights in the US, the Trump presidency, and so on. I mean, looking at it in the rounds, um, are we going miles backwards on this, or is this just a sort of one step back, two steps forward?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a huge question, and I'm not sure I would be ready to say how many steps backwards and forwards we're taking, but I do think it's more complicated than that the feminist movement has just been shoved back in the closet. I think that part of what we're seeing is that there's a lot of pushback from some major feminist victories, but also the feminist movements, which are plural. I mean, there are many different strands of feminisms, even within a place like the United States, much less if you think, globally, have really shifted the paradigm of what we think of as a starting set of assumptions for all kinds of things, including policymaking, including research, including popular culture. So that I think the part of what we're seeing is a reaction to a shifting common sense. So that what seemed radical in the 1970s, including a right to free and fair and safe abortion, now seems for many women like an entitlement, like a human right. And so the challenge to that, the threat to take that back, has been, I think, met with a lot of feminist activism and a response to that activism. There are signs of hope, I should say, even within the United States, but elsewhere, the Mexican Supreme Court just affirmed that would be a constitutional violation to criminalize abortion federally. In the United States, in places where there have been major abortion issues on the ballot, most notably in Michigan, and then recently in Ohio, where it was kind of disguised as this what percentage should it take to amend a constitution, which was in response to a grassroots effort to amend the Constitution to protect the right to abortion. So the vote to raise the percentage required to amend the Constitution went down. It failed, that is to say. It seems in some ways like a reasonable demand, right? It should take 60% or 2/3, whatever you want to say, to amend the Constitution, because it was tied to an effort to challenge abortion protections. It failed. And I think that shows that even in a quite conservative state, this is a state that used to be a swing state, but has voted with the Republican Party, with the Conservative Party, for several election cycles now, that there's a strong pushback against the challenges to abortion rights. I don't want to say we can like dust off our hands here. I think there's a lot of places where, as governments change, I mean, Argentina is one. In 2020, Argentina secured a right to abortion. I think with a new government that may be withdrawn. And certainly in a lot of places in Latin America, the trend has been against sort of reproductive rights. But I don't think that all the news is bad. I'll put it that way. And I think that part of the reason that all the news is not bad is that there are these really quite substantial mobilizations. I mean, I'm started as a historian of Latin America, so that's where my gaze turns first, and it is amazing. I mean, there's been this series of feminist strikes that are about other things too. They're about gender violence, and they're about recognition of labors of social reproduction, but they were quite centrally about reproductive justice and the right to abortion. And so in 2020, when the Argentine legislature affirmed abortion rights, it was in response to what was called the Marea Verde, the green tide of these massive feminist demonstrations that were taking place all over Latin America. I mean, they take place in Mexico and in Chile and all over the place. So I think there's two things happening here. I mean, to speak to a little bit more to your question about where this fits into the history, I think that one of the critiques of feminisms earlier, so starting from the early 20th century, but certainly in the mid 20th century and into the 1970s, critiques from the left, I should say, was that feminism tended to focus on individual rights and in the 70s, as more women entered the workforce, and things like the glass ceiling and occupational opportunities and so forth, and not on the kind of big structural questions that the people on particularly the Marxist left were concerned with. And it was seen as being, and not seen, it was legitimately labeled as a movement that was mostly of white, university-educated, urban women. And I would say that was true in most of the world through the 1970s, that characterization more or less held. I think that there are a couple, I'm a historian, so I think in terms of conjunctural moments of when the wheel turns a bit. I think in the early 1980s, which for you folks is the beginning of the Thatcher period, but also for for us, it's the beginning of the Reagan period. In Latin America and most of the global South, it's the beginning of the induction of structural adjustment programs.
Yeah.
So all of those programs that tried to privatize welfare services, we're actually speaking today on the 50th anniversary of the US-sponsored coup in Chile, which in some ways sort of initiates that whole process. Chile becomes a laboratory for the privatization of the welfare state and for welfare services. But after the Latin American debt crisis in 1982, that all just kind of cascades, and with rampant inflation, a lot of services just eliminated, a lot of women of popular sector women being made then to provide services that had been provided by the state, or to do a lot of caretaking, as it turns out, for community members and family members that suddenly were unemployed, were kind of alienated from their communities and workplaces. It creates all manner of burdens, and that kind of shifts feminism once again, in that you start to see broader alliances between these middle-class university-educated women who I think had legitimately sought out alliances with popular women, and popular women just felt like they were not interested. They didn't understand. I mean, to connect with the earlier conversation, abortion rights had not been a major demand for a lot of these women. In fact, the bigger demand was what we now put in the frame of reproductive justice, which is things like forced sterilization and the imposition, because of a concern about population control, the imposition of birth control measures in places like India, places like Mexico, Puerto Rico. So in the 80s, you see more of an alliance between a popular movement and a sort of university-educated movement. That changes a bit in the 1990s. You get this shift toward what's often referred to as an NGOization of feminism, a kind of professionalization. In a way, this is it's a blessing and a curse, a feature and a bug, as they say. It's a feature in that it means that a lot of governments and a lot of international organizations are introducing what they call gender mainstreaming. So after the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, often called CEDAW, passes in 1979. It's a UN convention signed by most countries, not by the United States and not by, I think, South Sudan and a couple of other places, but most countries in the world, and most member states of the United Nations have signed it. Create reporting requirements for member states. So they hire gender experts who are responsible for those reporting requirements. So by the late 1980s and early 90s, you have a kind of class of people who are professionally trained, or sometimes called femocrats, so they're kind of professionally trained feminist administrators. And there emerges another tension, I think, between grassroots feminism and what's seen as this kind of more militant shake up the system feminism, and what's seen as this like part of the system feminism. And in the 2000s, I think that as there's more and more challenges to neoliberalism in general, you get another kind of turn of the wheel with new feminisms. And I think the precursor of what we're seeing now with these waves of massive strikes, right? Like every March 8th, which is International Women's Day, you get these huge strikes So much more of a mass participation movement. I think a lot more reckoning in sometimes difficult ways with the universalist assumptions from those earlier waves of feminism of like, first of all, what is a woman? So where do trans women fit into there? What do we do with differences about race and indigeneity and all kinds of cultural and epistemological differences that might. So now I don't want to have too wiggish like now we have this progressive, victory, but I do think we're looking at a sort of different moment now where the conflicts that were earlier seen, I think in the 1970s, were seen as a failing. Like we all need to unite behind a single feminism. The conflicts now are seen as part of what keeps feminisms dynamic and engaged and constantly adapting and able to form there's a wonderful political theorist in Argentina named Veronica Gago who has this term of transversal feminisms, meaning able to make these connections around particular issues and across some pretty significant differences. That's where I think we are right now. And that is to say, the backlash that we're seeing, right, the incel movement and some serious increases in gender violence against trans women, against straight women, like it's very widespread. Is both, I think, a response to that and also just being met with a lot of resistance. I mean, the term femicide, which is now a legal term, right? And then most countries in Latin America, again, there's a treaty that all the member states of the Organization of Members of American States have signed, except the United States and Canada and Cuba, which is interesting, but which makes gender violence, a crime. And so all of these member states have had to come up with juridical measures, legal and statutory measures to deal with the problem of gender violence. So these are, this is not eliminated gender violence, for example, in Latin America or any place of the other places that have tried to, India and places that have tried to legislate around this. But it's drawn more attention to it, and things that once were seen as, boys will be boys, or this is just the natural order of things, or this is a problem that can't be solved, or it's a private matter, or are now, this is the classic feminist project, right? Push those private problems out into the public square and make us all reckon with them. So that's where I think we are now. And that's a kind of potted history of to answer.
Oh, that was fantastic. That was a great achievement, I think, of a very difficult question. I just want to add another dimension to that, and that's sort of social media.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be a place where, of course, people can let out a lot of hate anonymously. And I know here, for instance, if you're a MP, a woman MP or something, the sort of abuse you get is incredible. And of course now on Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, it's anything goes. And we have TikTok and influencers there.
I mean,
how to deal with that?
Well, I mean, social media is kind of a cesspool, I'm not going to lie. And I think that X, nay Twitter, is maybe the worst of it. That said, for all of the hate that's out there, social media has also been critical for these mobilizations. I mean, the hashtag movements, Neonamas, which is or now it's Neonamemos. This is a kind of changed its name, but that mobilize women around gender violence issues. I don't know if you ever saw, there was a famous performance that took place in Chile called Un violador en tu camino, a rapist in your path, that came with this song and dance and a whole thing that became a kind of performance art that groups of women started performing all over the world, and it was spreading because people were posting it on, sorry, my social media ignorance is going to show here, but I think on maybe Instagram or TikTok, and people were performing. So I hear you. I think that there's a lot of bile on social media, but there actually just seems to be a lot of activism. And I think that particularly for younger women, I'm speaking totally anecdotally here, so pardon me. This is not a research study I'm presenting, but it does seem anecdotally that younger women, for all of the emotional distress that social media can sometimes cause, are also finding a lot of role models on social media, right? That they're finding women that are young to me, but like women in their 20s who are succeeding and, you know, occupying their bodies in confident ways, and, you know, just sort of out there in the world and speaking their mind. And I think, again, I don't mean to sound naive about the incel thing is particularly alarming, I guess. And you're right, the public figures, I mean, I think the most public figures just ignore all that stuff because it's just really, it's just vile. I don't, you know, but I yes, I mean, there's the problem whether this stuff mobilizes, and I think this is a topic for a whole other interview with a expert in this area of social media, but the kind of siloing so that something like an incel movement seems a reasonable thing, right? Or that people, or storming the US Capitol seems like a reasonable thing, right? The things that come to right become this is Gramsci 101, right? Like the ways that media cultivates a particular common sense within a particular public. And I think we're seeing some of that, but that plays all ways. You can have a counter hegemonic project for every hegemonic project.
And what
Again,
about, so moving on to a bit more of a niche, I suppose, the economics discipline.
yes, bless its
From
heart.
as far as I see, it's been somewhat late in the day in terms of facing up to these sorts of issues of structural sexism and so forth. Is that fair?
As a profession itself,
As a profession, if you look at like the big, you know, the big conferences and beginning to talk about it a bit, and academics, female academics, beginning to talk about their experiences. This has been, seems to be a relatively recent.
I mean, I would say, and I know it better in the United States and elsewhere, that the discipline of economics is not well known for its diversity on any front.
Yes.
And in the United States, I would say, including epistemological and field diversity. It's a very, I think, pretty constrained field in the United States compared to other places, other economics departments in other countries. There are very few heterodox economics departments in the United States. And the field is overwhelmingly dominated by men, and I think mostly white men. I think that's a little more diversity now, but it's and not all. I mean, there are, I think, more, you know, again, this is partly a pipeline issue. I think that departments are trying to admit more women into PhD programs to create a more robust pipeline professionally. Some of those women are then hired out of academia because there are a lot of opportunities outside of academia for economists. Less so for historians, but yes, for economists. But so that you know, I think there are various reasons that is the case. The problem of the discipline not taking feminist questions more seriously is a longstanding one. It's one that's been, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day because Margaret Reed published The Economics of Household Production the same year that Simon Kuznets starts producing his national accounting system, right? So it's those two things kind of are born at the same time. And Phyllis Dean, who actually was a British economist and who started out by trying to there's a wonderful article about this, but helping the British government figure out a colonial accounting system. Also, again, we didn't call any of this feminist economics, but also looked at what was happening in what's now Nigeria and said, this isn't, like, none of this is going to work with the way you understand what an account looks like. Like, it doesn't, like, this economy doesn't fit into that framework. So I think that the question that has been fundamental to feminist economics as a field from its very first instantiations in a kind of formal way, like calling it feminist economics in the kind of late 70s, but really in the 80s and institutionalizing in the early 90s, it starts with this question about the system of national accounts and GDP, and seen as standing in for an economy, right? Seen as standing in for what we need to measure and what measures economic health and so forth. And that ignores almost all of women's labor in most of the world, right? I mean, it's kind of breathtaking. And then it leads to, I think, a kind of, I mean, the field of feminist economics is itself quite diverse. There's a lot of different areas within it. I think one of the divides you see certainly is whether an objective should be to try to find a way to impute value to all of that labor and then somehow pull it in. And there's all of these like satellite accounts with a system of national accounts. You try to like pull those in versus people who I think resist the push toward imputing market values. And there's someone like Marilyn Waring who I think started out in one camp and then moved to the other. I mean, she started out kind of making a strong argument for counting women's labor in GDP, and I really moved, I think in part because of her concern with environmental issues as well, that like there just was that there was no that the environment is priceless, right? That you can't, that imputing a value to the health of a mountain or a forest or to the well-being of a child is counterproductive in that sense. So that was, I think, one of the splits. Sorry, you're clearly trying to ask me a question.
I'm just going to, because one of the things I was wondering about is that I suppose, isn't there in feminist economics a key sort of question of power relations, which obviously is fundamental to feminism?
Yes.
And social structures and things like this, which they've always been ignored by mainstream economics anyway, haven't they? So
right.
Do you think that's part of the problem, that if you've got a discipline that focuses on the individual as a unit, right. And all individuals are the same, really in terms of maximizing utility, etc., that all structures of power, all social structures, are totally ignored. So can't really bring in those sorts of things for women, can they? Because they'd have to change the discipline fundamentally.
Right. I mean, I think there's a few, the emergence of behavioral economics notwithstanding, the figure of the rational economic man, it just seems like won't die. It's like the zombie figure that like get rid of, even though there's obviously considerable evidence that that's not a reasonable way to think about how economies work. People just simply don't make decisions that way. But also that the structures of power in a complicated way, right? Which is a very layered thing that's about the actual structures of power, like the levers of government and, corporate hiring policies, whatever, being controlled.
And structural and supply chain structures of economies, which are ignored, never looked at.
Yes, but also, cultural structures and linguistic structures that make it quite difficult, I think, in most contexts. I would say by far the majority of contexts. I mean, this was something that maybe you'd want to assess more systematically. It's very, very difficult for women not to see child rearing as a principal calling. And I mean, not that should be, I guess a large part of what feminist economists would say is, and that's good. I mean, Nancy Fulbright, who's one of the main feminist economists in the field of care economics, has, I think, argued quite convincingly that if we see the raising of children or the care of the disabled as a public good, as a social good, then we have to think very differently about how we value that. And that, I think, has been a fundamental feminist argument, but it's not. There's a long way to go in terms of policy that would reflect a shared understanding. There's a lot of discourse about, mothers are great and we all motherhood and all that, and about the value, importance of families and the importance of raising children. There's very little. I mean, even, I obviously that there's a range. The Scandinavian countries tend to be much better about this stuff. The U.S. is notoriously terrible in terms of supporting things like childcare and parental leave. But really, in no place is actual value given to that kind of work. In some places, you have a kind of mother's wage or UBI or some sort of social kind of usually a pro-natalist policy but that's a little different than recognizing the labor.
I was just thinking, the word value is quite interesting, because obviously economists interpret that in a particular way, i.e. linked to some monetary value or in
Right.
some sort of monetary exchange. And of course,
Right.
value in common parlance
Mhm.
does not necessarily, how do you value something? Do you value your grandmother? You don't pay for her. You treat her in certain ways and you
Right.
respect her and these
Right.
sorts of things, don't you? So
Yeah.
I wonder, are we, because this sort of, I wonder whether, this focus on trying to put numbers on things, I'm in the sort of non-numbers camp because
Yeah.
I think you need to maybe look more at the governance and rules and voice and all these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is
I
that
mean, one reason to be in the non-numbers camp is that it's really hard. The numbers game is difficult. The one place where I think we're seeing some really good work on this, and not that I guess I would want to separate the questions of, could we find a mode of recognizing value in that vernacular sense, right? And thereby providing means support for this kind of, let's just say, care labor. If in terms of care labor, we're talking about the sort of time, attention, expertise, effort that goes into sustaining the well-being of, and we might include in sustaining the well-being of dependents, so children, disabled, elderly, all that, also sustaining the well-being of environments, and sustaining, I think importantly, also the well-being of cultures and communities, right? That's a little different from that social part that's more dependent. But those are three realms I think are all quite important. So if we want to think about ways of not imputing a price or a market value, but valuing it in that more vernacular sense, one way that I think that a lot of feminist economists have been thinking about it, and I think it is a way that you can measure it without pricing it, if that makes sense, is some really excellent research using time use studies. And time use studies are, again, there's some issues about methodology. There's different methodologies, and I think that one of the things that we would want to agree upon is a standard methodology. The Mexican government actually has a methodology that's quite widely used, and maybe that would be one. The U.S. has a different one, but of how you count that labor. And if you could separate it from its market value, which is the only thing that GDP gives us, right? GDP just gives us market value. If you could separate it from that market value, it would allow us to measure it, which I think in the kind of measure what you treasure mantra, I do think that the measurement of it, unless we can fully abandon our neoliberal shackles, the measurement of it does seem critical for recognition. And then the question is, once you have that recognition, what do you do with that policy-wise? And that's, I think, another set of concerns.
But I wonder, this is another thing about economics, is seems to somewhat fetishize quantification as a research methodology compared to quality. Anything that's not quantified is anecdote, or it doesn't really count.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, the project that I'm working on right now is kind of history of the field of feminist economics, mostly from the global South, like the ways that a lot of the challenges, the more structural challenges, came from activist intellectuals based in the global South. And I could talk all day about that if you're interested. But one of the things that really struck me is that one of the first of these organizations is one called the African Association for Women on Research and Development. And their starting principle was that they were going to decolonize research. That was the phrase they used, which struck me because I think of that as being a kind of latter day phrasing. And what they meant by decolonizing research was, among other things, a shifting away from this intense quantification of everything. This is in the mid 70s, and they're already saying, like, the quantification of everything is incredibly dangerous. And they're saying, particularly for women in these contexts, but not only. And it's kind of heartbreaking to read the stuff they're writing in the mid 70s, because they were really quite prescient about the implications for the environment, the implications for societies, and certainly the implications for women and women's labor. So that's an early push. I suppose the question I would ask is, this is a constant challenge that feminists are always facing, right? Which is that, like, with every revolution, they're told, come the revolution, you'll get your liberation, your emancipation will come. I mean, unless we can really dismantle the neoliberal paradigm, we are kind of stuck for the moment with people only recognizing things that can get measured. And I think there's a lot of great work challenging systems of measurement and contextualizing the cultural and power relations that shape ideas about measurement. But as a kind of mainstream pervasive way of seeing the world, it's we're very far from being able to abandon it or being able to just ignore it. I think if we ignore it, we then just leave that to the people who have the most power and still speak in those terms. I think, I mean, to the extent, I will say this, I think there's a lot of amazing research about, for example, care and the value of care, a ton. And it's been a problem that particularly feminist economists have been talking about for about a half century now. I mean, you could say for more than a century if you think about some of that early stuff from the early 20th century and late 19th century about these issues. What we have lacked this whole time has been sufficient political will to really take this on as an issue. I think you could say a similar question about the environmental issues related, and those are kind of, I think, quite intricate issues. And so the question about measurement and numbers is, if we leave the whole field of legibility to the people who are still going to traffic in GDP, are we ever going to be able to muster the political will to challenge that as a system? So
well, I think the big question that I might have to leave this with, because I think we've had a fascinating conversation. I've really learned a lot from hearing your take on where things have come from, and I'm glad at the end of the day it's not quite as negative as I think some people will see. But
that the looks.
it is obviously still hugely challenging, and it's been fascinating to put all that in perspective. And yes, the measurement thing that will run and run, won't it?
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. It was great talking with you.
Brilliant.